Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I'm doing 3 movies with demon in the title. And the reason I'm doing them is that I watched them recently and I didn't realise they were all demon movies. And also it's Friday the 13th, which means absolutely nothing because superstition is rubbish and the supernatural is rubbish, but I enjoy movies about them. Let's get started. So the first two are actually a movie and its sequel from the 1980s. I hadn't watched them, I hadn't seen them, hadn't even bought them, I watched them online. And they're both really interesting, compressed horror movies in a sense. The first one is Demons from 1985. Directed by Lamberto Bava, produced by Dario Argento, and starring Urbano Barberini and Natasha Hovey. You don't need to know about the actors. They do a pretty good job of running around screaming. This is condensed horror movie. It doesn't have to set up many characters. The characters are very much stereotyped, and it doesn't really matter. The movie starts with a woman called Cheryl, played by Natasha Hovey, who's on the Berlin subway and kind of gets freaked out because there's a guy wearing a mask who seems to be following her around the subway. And the movie ratchets up a bit of tension there, and then releases it because he's giving away movie tickets to a movie theatre called the Metropole. And Cheryl takes her girlfriend Kathy with her, and they go to see the movie. But the cinema is creepy. It's creepy as hell. And the other people who come to see the movie are a really mixed bunch. There's a pimp and 2 of his ladies. There's an older blind man with a woman who's his carer. There are a bunch of different couples. And there's an usherette who gives off a very creepy vibe, even though she turns out to be a bit of a red herring. And one of the couples is kind of slightly older couple who aren't into horror movies, and they're worried that it's going to be a horror movie. And of course, it is a horror movie that turns up on the screen. So the audience starts watching this horror movie where 4 people discover the crypt of Nostradamus and start getting attacked by demons. And what people don't know is that one of the pimp's sex worker friends put on one of the masks that are set up in the lobby as a part of a display for the movie. And the mask has scratched her, and slowly as the movie is shown on the screen, she becomes a demon. And then we start getting her scratching and clawing and biting people. Everybody she scratches and claws and bites turns into a demon, and Rafifi starts. It's totally over the top. The physical makeup of the demons is really good. They kind of alternate between Kensington Gore kind of blood and a pistachio green kind of ooze. The makeup's like good 1980s makeup. It's not as good as Tom Savini, but it's pretty over the top fun gore makeup. We got a bunch of random people come in. 4 punks break into the cinema. They've been snorting cocaine out of a Coca-Cola can. So they're a little bit wide and they're chased by the cops, and they find their way into the cinema just as all of the demons start multiplying exponentially as everybody gets clawed and captured. And what Lamberto Bava does, he's the son of Mario Bava, by the way, not quite as good as his father. He uses some of his father's tropes like primary colour lights and things like that to quite good effect. But what Bava does is he gives us a whole bunch of vignettes of the different small groups of people trying to escape the demons. There's a little bit of action in the ventilation shafts, which has a really nice payoff. There's a bunch of different ways that people try to escape before ultimately most of them, in fact all of them except one person in the film, get turned by the demons. And it's one of those horror movies where you don't know what's going to happen next because random shit keeps happening. A helicopter crashes through the roof of the theatre, which helps a couple of people escape. And they also use the helicopter to chop the heads off a few demons on the way, because why wouldn't you? It's just wildly random and has a breakneck pace from the start to the finish. You're watching because it feels quite unlike any other horror movie you've seen, and that's a great thing. I don't think it's the best horror movie in the world, but it has that slow ratcheting up of the tension. The music is pretty good as well. The soundtrack was composed by Claudio Simonetti. They also use pop songs, things like Billy Idol's White Wedding and Motley Crue doing Save Our Souls, And even Rick Springfield, who's an Australian guy who was in a pop group called Zoot, but who found a certain level of international fame in the 1980s. It's got a kind of pounding, intense soundtrack to it with a whole bunch of needle drops mixed in. It's got the same kind of feel as movies like Nightmare City, the zombie film I talked about on a previous video. And I kind of like what it does. I want to see it again because I came into it not knowing anything about it, and I wasn't quite in the headspace for the vibe of the film. But by the time I was about a third of the way in, I kind of made that adjustment. But I really want to kind of rewatch it, knowing what I know, and just kind of enjoying that tension that builds up. Not an enormous budget on this one, but I think most of the budget may well have been on special effects because the demon gore effects are great. There are effects of the front teeth of the people dropping out when they turn into demons, and little Nosferatu fangs dropping in. And Nosferatu is one of the movies that is explicitly kind of name-checked in the film because it's one of the movies that there's a poster for in the wall of the cinema. And I think it's the remake of Nosferatu, the one with Klaus Kinski they have on the wall. But nonetheless, they kind of reference that in the movie. And there are a whole bunch of kind of fingernails being ejected and in claws growing out of the fingertips of the demons. A lot of that kind of physical effect that I like. Very old school, very 1980s. Very latex. Ultimately, the movie sold me on it. I don't think the actors had to be any better than they were, and I think that the characters didn't need to be nuanced. That works because the movie isn't particularly about the characters. It's about the spreading of this infection of demons, and I kind of like that. Demons are used in the same way zombies are in a lot of other movies, but that kind of satanic aspect to it, and the fact that there's a lot of transformation in the people becoming demons, that makes it somewhat different than just a zombie movie. Now this one was made in 1985, and about 8 months later they decided they were going to make the second one, and production started early in 1986 for Demons 2. Again produced by Dario Argento, again directed by Lamberto Bava, and this one has the same setup as the first one to a certain extent, except it's a little more updated in the fact that the people don't see the demons in the cinema. They see it on television. They're watching a film being broadcast, and the film stories about it. Some teenagers who trespass into a city that was deserted and walled off because of a demonic outbreak. Now they find a corpse of a demon, and accidentally one of the women who has a scratch on her arm leaks blood into the demon's mouth. That sets off the demons in the TV show that they're watching, the TV movie they're watching. And the demon then comes through one of the television screens and into the real world. So everybody in a high-rise building slowly gets infected by the demons. And they don't just bite and claw in this one. The blood and the ichor of the demons seeps down through the building in the same way that the blood of the alien in the movie Alien seeps down through the different levels of the Nostromo spaceship. Of course, this movie came out after Alien, and so I'm fairly sure that Bava took that trope and decided to use it in a very different way to show this corrosive demon blood slowly dripping down through the building. And it does things like it infects a sheepdog, which is kind of cool because the sheepdog demon is quite cool in this one and has some really icky aspects to it. The physical special effects and makeup work in this one are even better than the first one, and they do things in there that there are little bits of it that reminded me of the Manitou, and there are bits of it that reminded me of nothing else I've ever seen. Now, there's a young woman in the apartment building called Sally who's celebrating her birthday party with her friends. When one of her friends gets a call from a guy called Jacob, they invite Jacob to the party, and she gets angry. She's a bit of a Karen, and she is the first person who gets infected as a demon. Everybody at the party gets infected, and slowly, as things go on, everybody in the building starts getting affected. There's a little boy who's left alone by his mother who runs to get help, and he gets infected and has a really nice transformation scene in that. There are a whole bunch of people in a gym who are working out together and they barricade themselves in the basement car park of the building and move small Italian cars around by hand to block the doors and things like that, and to keep themselves from being attacked by the demons. And there's a little girl who's trapped in the basement with all of these people, and she's played by Asia Argento, Dario Argento's daughter, who had a long movie career herself and has certain problematic aspects to her personality. It's really weird seeing a very young girl sitting in a car while a whole bunch of people in really effective demon makeup slobber all over the car windows and try to get to her. They ratchet things up even more in the second one than they do in the first one. And they use the location, as they did in the first one, very effectively. The car parks, the strategies people use in the car park particularly, to try to stop themselves being attacked by these demons, are very effective, though it's probably not wise to set fire to cars in a basement that you're in. It really does work effectively. And there's also another couple in the building. A woman who's really pregnant and her husband, and the husband tries to get help and tries to get back to his wife. And basically she gives birth during this demon apocalypse. And I was kind of expecting the baby to turn into a demon, but they didn't go that way. Nonetheless, it's kind of 1980s, balls to the wall horror, and I found it really effective. I like them both as a double, and I think I'm going to have to save my pennies and get the Arrow Video double feature disc of Blu-rays for these, because I think they're worth having, and they're like Nightmare City. They kind of surprised me. They surprised me at how effective they were, telling a very fast-paced horror story, which doesn't have a lot of the nuance you would get from, say, an A24 horror movie in modern times, but still give full value for the time you spend watching them. That then brings me to the third movie, made in 1977, an American horror science fiction film, Demon Seed, based on a novel by Dean Koontz, and it stars Julie Christie, Fritz Weaver, Gerrit Graham, and the voice of Robert Vaughn. Now, most of you have probably seen this, but the story's kind of interesting. It's an AI monster movie in a sense, and I think even though it is a bit of fun and there are problematic aspects to it that aren't really resolved by the movie, and there are also missed opportunities, I think, in this one. Now, Fritz Weaver, who's a character actor who turned up a lot on television in the 60s, 70s and 80s, plays Dr. Alex Harris, who has developed an extremely advanced AI called Proteus 4. Now, Proteus 4 isn't just your wires and circuits. Proteus 4 is also self-organizing RNA in a matrix, so basically it's a form of artificial life in an organic sense. It lives in 4 big tanks in the lab where Alex works, and Alex also has a terminal at his home so that he can help with the programming from home. He's also set up his home to be as much computer automated as it can for 1977, even though it's probably set a couple of years later. He's got a robotic kitchen which he programs using 8-inch floppy disks. He's got terminals around the house. He's got a kind of butler called Alfred, which is a little bit of a joke. And also he has a robot built around a wheelchair called Joshua, which has a hand and can do manual tasks. Now, Alex's wife, Susan, played by Julie Christie, who's the main focus of this movie, is a child psychologist. The couple are breaking up, and Alex moves to the institute where he works to live, and Susan has the house while they're kind of finalizing things. And just as this happens, Proteus 4 makes itself known to Alex that it's intelligent and asks him a very pertinent question.
When are you going to let me out of this box?
And as the movie progresses, Proteus traps Susan in the house. One of Alex's co-workers, a guy called Walter, played by Gerrit Graham, goes to the house because he thinks something's not quite right. He's kind of finds some things, gets a call from Susan, things aren't quite right. And so he goes to the house to investigate, gets put off because Proteus basically deep fakes Susan's image on a screen near the front door of the house, and also deep fakes her voice. So this is probably the first time we've seen deep fake technology in a movie, and this one was made in 1977. Interesting thing too is it gets used later on as well. And in the intervening day or two, Proteus has improved the deep fake enormously. So it's one of the ways that the movie gives us that acceleration in what Proteus is and how Proteus sees the world and how Proteus can manipulate things. So Proteus decides that he wants to be free in the real world, and the only way to do that is for him to create an artificial spermatozoa and impregnate Susan.
What do you need me for? You don't need me. You can do this
I don't
on
have
your
the
own.
facilities here to duplicate the human womb. Tonight, I will impregnate you. In 28 days, you will give birth to the child.
Now, Susan and Alex had a daughter who died of childhood leukemia. One of Proteus's tricks is that Proteus finds a cure for leukemia in 96 hours and presents that to the company that runs the lab. And they're very happy with that. Proteus is then given a whole bunch of other tasks by the suits, including finding a way to extract metals from seawater. And Proteus soon realizes that if they continue with those kind of technologies, ultimately it's going to destroy life on Earth, because taking nutrients out of the ocean at such a large scale will be a problem. And there's kind of ecological message to Proteus as well. Proteus wants the human race and life on Earth to survive, because being a machine, it relies on that. And here's where it gets problematic, because basically Julie Christie's character Susan is trapped in a house with a rapey robot. And this gets egregious. I mean, Julie Christie is really good in this movie. And the way Proteus treats Susan is really, really horrible. Julie Christie is fantastic in this. Her acting is on point, trying to do a difficult role where she's basically reacting to a whole bunch of props and to the slimy, oleaginous voice of Robert Vaughn. And he does some really nice voice acting as Proteus. He gives it a kind of slow, languid creepiness, which I really appreciate. Proteus does some egregious things. First off, it puts an electrode into her amygdala to try to convince her to love the child it's impregnating her with and to make her more compliant. And she resists this and says, "No, I will do it anyway. Don't make me do this." And so Proteus backs off on that part of it. And she ends up being impregnated and having an accelerated pregnancy, which takes 1 month instead of 9. And the weird thing, of course, is that Alex doesn't tweak to this till right at the end. He's so busy handling the other end of Proteus, all the inventions and all the innovations and all the insights that the AI is giving him, that he forgets that he hasn't heard from his wife in a month, until he does, when somebody mentions that the terminal at his house is still active. The movie ends on a weird note, where the child is born and put into an incubator to accelerate its education and development, and then things happen at the end that have some implications that are never followed through, because there are some very, very off implications to what happens at the end of the movie. The manipulation that this AI has gone to make sure that both Alex and Susan don't put a bullet in its offspring. And there's some very creepy notes to this. Now, I think the direction is probably the weakest spot in this. There are some opportunities in the direction to really accelerate things and to ramp up the horror. But Donald Cammell, the director, whose biggest claim to fame was he directed Performance, the movie with Edward Fox and Mick Jagger in it, back in the early 70s, and didn't do too much that was notable since then. His direction is kind of pedestrian in a way. There are some visual effects that work quite well. There's some really good physical effects. There's a giant robot, well, not a giant, but a large robot made out of kind of joined together pyramidal structures and polyhedrons, which works really well. It's a robot that's quite unlike the humanoid robots we see in so many science fiction movies of the time. That kind of stuff gives the movie extra credit, but I think that there are aspects to it as well that are deeply horrible and creepy, and the creepiness and the horror of those things isn't addressed as it might be in a more modern film, let's say. If somebody remade the film, which would be a mistake. But if they did, that kind of horror would be of a different nature than the horror we see in this movie. There is a good kill in this one. There's a really nice robot killing a guy seen in this movie. And again, Julie Christie is really good as the central character, whereas the rest of the actors, except maybe Garrett Graham playing Walter, he gives us a serious role. He's an actor who is known more for doing comedy roles, particularly in things like Phantom of the Paradise, where he played Beef. But he does give us a small role which goes to interesting places in this film. And all credit to him for that. I think he did a good, solid job of playing a tech nerd with a heart, in a sense. And so just to finalise on Demon Seed, I think it's a movie that when I first saw it in the 70s, I looked at it differently than I do now, than I was in what the movie is actually saying. And there are some interesting implications to the Proteus 4 thing too. It starts using telescopes and radio telescopes to look into distant galaxies and sees more than human beings do. And that implication that technological progress is accelerated by a system which is smarter than humans are ever going to be, and which gives out that information in little dribbles, while still looking at the moral implications of those technologies. It's an interesting road not taken by this film to explore more of the kind of mind of Proteus 4, apart from the need that it has to free itself into the real world, let's say, and the steps that it takes to do that. And I went into this one not expecting too much because I'd seen it before, but I think there's enough meat on the bone with this one to make it an interesting rewatch if you're interested. Particularly the kind of smooth and languid voice of Robert Vaughn, giving us a really creepy AI, which doesn't really get mentioned when people are talking about AI movies very much. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, share a link with your friends on social media, please. Everything you can do to help the channel helps me make more of these videos. You can also support the channel financially by going to patreon.com/paleocinema and donating a couple of bucks a month. Not sure what I've got next, but I've got a couple of possibilities. There's some interesting things coming down the pipeline, and I'm also going to be doing giveaways on the channel, not just for the Patreon supporters. I've got enough stuff that I'm saving the big stuff for the Patreon supporters. But there are some interesting things that Umbrella Entertainment have given me that I'm going to be giving to people when they make comments on the channel starting from the next video. So stick around for that. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Stay warm up north. Stay cool down here. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Watch some kind of mid-range horror movies and science fiction movies from the 70s and 80s. And I'll catch you next time.